Well, welcome everyone to this legislation update. I want to mention that this is hosted by the IHA for IHA members. It is a special benefit for IHA members, and I am here representing Peter Giannetti, who could not be here today. He's normally the moderator on these webinars with us. Peter's under the weather, and we sent him all our wishes for a speedy recovery. And we want to say a huge thank you. We've been doing this webinar now for a couple of years with the IHA, and we're so grateful to them for this opportunity to bring this important information to their members and to the industry. And I'm joined today by three incredible partners, and I'll talk about all of that in a moment. But I want to welcome everyone to this information session on what's happening in the U.S. legislation and what's impacting the housewares industry. You will see that we are just calling it here a legislation update. We will be talking about PFAS, but it's gone beyond PFAS now. And it also covers lead and cadmium, so we'll be talking about that as well. And the goal here is that we provide an updated snapshot on where we are here today and what's impacting the industry. Quick update on the CBA before we get started. So for those who may not be familiar with the CBA, we are the Cookware and Bakeware Alliance, and we are a trade association delivering critical resources. And our goal is to unite the industry by setting engineering standards for product and consumer safety. We build this excellence through and connection through our four pillars of engineering, engagement, education, and expertise. Here is a snapshot of our membership. We're really proud of our members. We are 102 years old this year and growing, and really excited. Actually, I think we're 103 now. And here is a snapshot of our members. And a key part of the CBA are the great partners that we have, like the ones we have with us today, Tom Lee, Tobias Gerfin, and Steve Burns. We are so grateful to them. Steve is our latest connection from the Cookware Sustainability Alliance. The FEC has been an incredible partner on keeping on top of what's happening in Europe. And BCLP and Tom Lee specifically has really helped us navigate all this legislation and stay ahead of it. We're even looking to grow these partnerships with groups like the American Chemistry Council and AHAM, which is the Association of Household Appliance Manufacturers, two groups we've done some work with. So with all of these partners together, even with different viewpoints or different approaches, we collectively have the same mission, and that's to bring about positive change for the industry. And that's what today is all about. So quick synopsis of what we're doing here at the CBA before we jump into the actual updates. And this is what I've been working on over the last year or so. So first is, if you're not following us on social, make sure to do so. We're doing a lot of social shares on our education documents, key information that come from the documents on fluoropolymer education, PFAS education, life cycle assessment, all different topics. And they happen to be our top posts. You'll also notice on the first slide, there was a Good Science symbol. Our Good Science webpage, which hosts the education documents along with some other information, is our highest ranking webpage, getting over 3,000 hits last year. So people are looking for education and information. We also offer a legislation tracker. Actually, this is a picture of the old tracker. It's now a cloud-based system. It includes lead and cadmium and other legislation, and it is live. So it's broken out by state. And there's a link there to view the legislation if you are looking something up. The next part is we offer industry updates. So if there's a legislation that's enacted or moving fast or something we need to watch, we will put out an industry update, and it gives you a summary of the legislation, what you need to know, what you need to do, and several links. So these are great references. We'll even do ones like when AB 1200 came out to understand how to put things on your website. We have our education series. So for PFAS, we have 3 parts published. 1 is coming. Part 4 is coming. Part 1 is on cookware, and then PFAS and PTFE and what that all means, kind of getting into the first level of education on PFAS. Part 2 goes into fluoropolymers and human health. Part 3 goes a closer look at PFAS in cookware and bakeware and talks about environmental emissions, as well as feasibility of alternatives and other important topics. Part 4, which is in the works, is on socioeconomic impact. Those can all be found on the Good Science page. Coming soon, we're starting an education document on lead and cadmium topics to help in educating on that, which is the latest legislation out there impacting our industry. Both of those education document programs are done through our subcommittees, and we have really wonderful, powerful, engaged subcommittees across 82 members across 36 companies. We're very grateful to them. The latest for the CBA is our state engagement, which actually our next call, well, the representation for the CBA is happening later today with the MPCA in Minnesota. We are speaking to them regarding the test methodology identified for the lead and cadmium legislation. And the plan is in that to take what we learned from that engagement and what happens in that engagement, and then later this year, engage Washington. So there is work in progress at the state level. And what we normally do on this call in the past with the IHA, and I kept it in here, and I'm going to go super high level today, but you will be provided this recording. And if you have any questions, one, I highly recommend those education documents I mentioned, as well as just reach out and we'd be happy to give you more information. With PFAS, it's really important to know that this is a large family of substances. Each one has a significant varied number of properties, and each subgroups has very unique and specific differences. And while there's a lot of misunderstanding and confusion out there, but it's important to remember that PFAS is a group of chemicals that when used, their intention is to enhance or achieve a certain outcome with the betterment of that product and or situation in mind. So for example, there are PFAS chemicals that resist heat, grease, stains. There are some that are insulators. There are some that are conductors and other properties. There are thousands of these chemicals in this family, and they don't all look the same. And each group has different characteristics that define them. And it's really important to understand that one big difference is whether it's a fluorochemical or a fluoropolymer. And that is one of the biggest distinctions that's trying to be made with legislators. And understanding from there that the fluorochemicals, those are water soluble, fluoropolymers are not. And then there's different risk factors about mobility, toxicity, and persistence that makes even the chemicals within each family very different. So, but this first distinction is really important to remember about PFAS. And understanding the differences is what we need to do. And there are some agencies trying to do that and understand all these chemicals better. And through this science, we'll better understand the chemistries and therefore better know how to regulate them, and time is needed to do so. We use a fun analogy, which I believe was started by Tobias a few years ago, which is the mushrooms. I don't know if everyone knows this, but there's over 14,000 kinds of mushrooms in the world, and some are edible and some are toxic. And it took science time to figure that out and map it all out and understand it. We need the same time here. If we rush or act in panic to address concerns, as we've seen in other areas and other industries, we may face more concerning situations, regrettable substitutions, or unintended consequences that we're not where we want it to be. So right now, we need to take that time to get this right. And there's a lot of groups doing that. And one of them, I'm proud to pass the mic over to Steve at the Cookware Sustainability Alliance. And Steve, why don't you introduce yourself, and we'll do your part now.
Yeah, thank you, Fran. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. It's funny you say you're 103 years old. We may be 103 days old. Frankly, we are an alliance, as the name suggests, of companies, and you'll see them in the next slide, which we'll get to in just a second. But two companies originally came together from the cookware industry, two of the largest manufacturers in the world, frankly. We've been joined by a third, and what we wanted to do was advocate, which is a verb that translates into lobby. We exist to lobby legislatures and also to engage in rulemaking once laws are passed and the rules need to be promulgated. We formed a 501c3 in order to do that. And Fran, if you don't mind, the next slide, thank you. The companies at the top, Group SEB, Meyer Corporation, and the newest member, Tramontina. And this is a mission statement. I won't read it to you, but really what we're all about is bringing science-based information to advocate for our products. We think that there's been a lot of activity, and it goes back years. As I said, we were just formed late spring and summer of last year. So we're a little late to the game in some cases, like the state of Minnesota or Washington. But if you go to the next slide, please, Fran, the essence, and there's a lot of words on here. I'm committing PowerPoint sin, and I apologize. But this is what we take in around the country. We take in what we believe to be sound science. And the sound science means that fluoropolymers, which is what we're talking about, the most common one is PTFE, of course, which is used for nonstick cookware. They're not toxic. They have a decades-long history of safe and essential use. We point out that pacemakers and stents are coated in fluoropolymers before they're implanted into human bodies. And therefore, ergo, we don't see any toxicity over the last several decades. And as Fran said earlier, they're not water soluble. The basic chemistry of a fluoropolymer does not allow it, does not have the alkalines to attach to carbon or oxygen. And finally, that as an industry, we have not used PFOA for over a decade. And as a result, today's science, today's nonstick cookware has been approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration specifically for food contact, for the preparation of food. And you can see the words there at the bottom. You know, the large size of a fluoropolymer cannot be absorbed by the human body. And the same conclusion was reached by the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, a few years ago. And so, Fran, if you don't mind, we're a bit time constrained. I'm going rather quickly. This is what we parachuted into last summer. We thought it'd just be a few states. It turned out to be 11. And some are regulatory that were, as I said, laws that had already been passed. And Tom's going to go into a lot more detail on this, I'm happy to say. But we had to engage during the summer and into the fall in some pretty high profile cases. And two of which I'm very proud to say we actually achieved our goal. And there are two states that are among the bluest and most progressive, one of which I live in, California. The other one is New York. We were able to get cookware removed from PFAS bills that were moving through both Albany and Sacramento by bringing the science that I just showed you into the legislative arena and sitting down with authors of these bills and getting them to agree with us and say there's a long list of the usual, what I call the usual cast of products that need to be banned, but cookware simply does not belong on that list. Connecticut and Rhode Island, and the last two examples I'll use before we move on, we didn't arrive in time to impact whether or not the legislation was signed by those two governors, but the governor of Connecticut said rather publicly, and this was picked up in the media, the governor of Rhode Island said privately that even though they signed PFAS ban laws, they wanted to have cookware come back and talk to them, which we've done. And we already have a bill moving through Connecticut as a result that defines cookware in a way that will exempt fluoropolymer coated nonstick cookware. So again, even after the fact, when we do engage with the science, with our messages, with our studies, and they are, they're backed by decades of independent scientific study. We are making the case, and I have yet to be told that no, you're not convincing enough. We're not going to listen to you. And the final slide is just a snapshot of where we are today. Same slide with a couple new colors. 5 new states have already introduced it, and we're still in the first month of the year. Those are the yellow, and we did file litigation. And if somebody wants to hear more about it, I'm going to kick that over to my friend and colleague, Tom, who's a lawyer. But Illinois, Kentucky, New Jersey, Indiana, and Nevada are the new states. As a matter of fact, just this morning, I didn't have time to add another yellow dot. Virginia added a new bill, which is more about pre-treatment processes and the use of PFAS. It's not a ban on any product. It's not a focus on cookware. But the final thing I'd like to leave you with, and we can do more discussion in the Q&A, is, we are representing a single sector, a single product line, nonstick cookware. We're very careful not to talk about other products or other chemicals. And there are some, and I give them full credit, and I already mentioned them, the medical devices who are rightfully, perhaps, obtaining carve-outs. Nobody wants to stop pacemakers from being used in this country. But I would say to those other sectors that maybe use fluorochemicals and are thinking, well, let their grace of God go I, and too bad for cookware. That history has shown that some of these forces that are seeking to monitor or regulate or ban, quite candidly, fluoropolymers are not going to stop just with the cookware surface. If it's anywhere in a product that you make, if it's in any other sectors like aerospace, automobiles, and we know it is widely used, the chemical itself, if they can prove that it's harmful in cookware and food contact, then the logic leads to say, well, it's going to be harmful everywhere, because sooner or later it's either in the production side or in the end of life side, when they are saying, they being the people who are pushing these ideas, that it breaks down, it enters into somehow enters into the human ingestion or water, which even though we say it cannot possibly happen. So we invite everybody to join us in this fight, not just in housewares, not just in cookware, but this is something that we believe strongly about, and cookware is on the table today, so to speak. I would suggest very strongly others will soon be as well. So reach out if anybody wants to join the fight, because this map will have more dots on it very, very soon, and I welcome the company. So let me stop there. Thank you, Fran.
Thanks, Steve. Next up, we have Tobias Gerfen to give us an update on Europe.
Thank you, Fran. You just say what it's like before, because there's a big difference between Europe and the US, and that is when you look at the last slide from Steve, you saw a lot of state-specific solutions in every single state. That's not true in Europe. At this moment, I'm not aware of a single country where cookware or PTFE-coated cookware and bakeware is restricted or banned. So at this moment, it is on European level, so on federal level, and not on state level. Some countries are moving a little bit in this direction because they think Europe is moving too slowly, but otherwise that's not the case. And now you can go to it's similar to what Steve said. My slide here is just too much information in it, but it is the timeline, and I will go quickly through that. On the left, you see the past. So in February 2023, ECHA, which is the European Chemical Agency sitting in Helsinki, published a restriction for PFAS, a very broad one, very, very broad one. It was supported by 5 countries, those that you see here: Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. And then the legal process is that you have a 6 months consultation period, and they were surprised that they got 5,600 feedbacks. And most of them very long. This is the biggest restriction proposal ever in Europe. Last week, there was a lot of media attention and a lot of NGOs talking about the situation and saying that industry is lobbying or is sending too much information to regulators. My answer to that is, if you have the biggest regulation proposal or restriction proposal, you might end up with the biggest response by industry. But now, usually it should take them about a year to get through all of that. September 2023, so they should have been ready by September 2024. There are 2 committees working on it. It's the Risk Assessment Committee, called RAC, and the Socioeconomic Committee, SEAC. And they go application by application. So in last year, there were 2 sessions on food contact, so also cookware. In September, it was touched first time, and in November, there was a final discussion. Looking at the discussion, there's a high probability that they will separate professional use from consumer use. But again, these are assumptions, it's not final. We expect, now we are in 2025, and we expect in the second half of 2025, and maybe the first half of 2026, the publication of the final opinion of RAC on all the different applications. and of SEAC. So we are already in this first half of 2026. Then it takes about 6 months for ECHA to finish their opinion and sending it to the European Commission. So we're in the second half of 2026. From that on, usually it takes a year for the Commission, which is the government of the European Union, to draft a final restriction proposal. So we're in the second half of 2027. And then with all the different countries, there are 26, 27 countries in Europe, each of them has to agree to that. So it takes some time. So earliest at this moment, we would say it might get into force in second half 2028, maybe even first half of 2029. You add 18 months in case PTFE coated cookware would be restricted, which brings you to 2030. So based on what we see at the moment in Europe, until about first half or second half of 2030, PTFE coated cookware will be available in the market. You can sell it. Only then there will be a difference. So big difference to what we heard from Steve and what we'll hear from Tom. And therefore, and it might even be for professional applications that you have derogations of 5 to 12 years, which could bring us to 2035 or 2042. That we have more time to find alternatives which are true alternatives and not regretful substitutions. So that's very quickly the timeline. In Europe, we worked very hard, but we are a little bit more relaxed because there is nothing enforced at this moment, which is not true for everything that Tom will talk about now, because that's a completely different story in the US.
Thank you, Tobias. Yes, so next up is Tom Lee from BCLP Law. And Tom, I turn it over to you for the state regulation update.
Great, thank you all. As Tobias kind of alluded to, I will be the bearer of some bad news here, because there are a wide range of different laws that are already in effect, some that are going into effect soon that will have a very big impact on the industry, both in the PFAS space and, as Fran mentioned earlier, increasingly in the regulation of lead and cadmium in cookware products. So if you could advance the slides. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to touch on, because this is a big topic, so we tried to sort of boil it down into more digestible components. So overall, I want to give you a general look at the landscape of PFAS regulation in cookware, where we are, what the deadlines are, and then we'll go into a little more detail on examples of each of the two main categories of law. The first is law that requires disclosures, California AB 1200, and the second is a use prohibition ban, which has already gone into effect in Minnesota. And then we'll talk through some of the new lead and cadmium laws that have come out in the last couple of years, and which really mark a pretty significant change in the way that those metals are regulated in the context of cookware. So turning to the regulation of PFAS in cookware here, we can go to the next slide, Fran. Thank you for driving. So this gives you an overview of what has been enacted so far. So these are laws that have been passed at the state level related to PFAS in cookware. So 8 states so far, but what I think is particularly interesting about this map is, yes, you see regulation in California, in some of the New England states, which is where you would expect to see it. But the most stringent PFAS law that has been enacted so far is in Minnesota, which is kind of a departure from what we normally see in the regulatory context for these types of emerging contaminants. And it underscores the point that PFAS is sort of a bipartisan issue. We won't get into it on this presentation because I could spend a whole hour talking about it, but with the new federal administration coming in, there's a lot of discussion about how EPA will approach PFAS. And we'll see, but I think unlike some other Biden-era initiatives, PFAS may not be as much on the chopping block, given the fact that there are PFAS concerns in a wide range of states and a wide range of communities. So this is the current landscape of laws that have been passed so far. And we'll go now to some timelines. So as you'll see here, there's 2 main categories of these laws. The ones below the bar here are laws that require some kind of labeling or disclosure to consumers. The ones above the line are use prohibitions. And so where we are, there are 2 state laws, California and Colorado, that are already in effect that require on-product and website disclosures for PFAS, and in the case of California, other chemicals. We are also now at the point where the Minnesota use prohibition has gone into effect. But you'll see there are a lot more states lined up that will go into effect over the next several years. And maybe just to underscore one point that Steve made, for anyone on the line or with contacts at companies that are not directly part of the cookware industry and may not be subject to these laws that we'll be talking about today, there is a trend to continue to increase the regulation and legislation of these chemicals. And there are 2 states already that have passed laws that include kind of a dragnet provision. So in Maine and Minnesota, by 2032, all consumer products can no longer contain intentionally added PFAS unless you have specifically asked for and obtained a currently unavoidable use approval from the state, essentially something from the state agency saying that you're allowed to continue using PFAS. But absent that, in those 2 states, by 2032, all consumer products, not just cookware, can no longer contain intentionally added PFAS. So that ultimate prohibition is coming. It's arrived a little sooner for the cookware industry. So we'll transition now into looking at examples of the different types of laws. So California AB 1200, at its core it's just a notice provision. It does not require any reformulation of product, does not require any changes in your manufacturing process, but it does require that you provide both website and on-packaging disclosures to consumers. Now, it was billed as a PFAS law, and it absolutely includes PFAS compounds, but it's important to point out that that's not the only thing that it requires disclosures of. So the California law requires the disclosure of up to 3,300 different chemicals that are on a candidate chemicals list issued by the state. That includes the entire Prop 65 list, for those of you who may have the pleasure or displeasure of having dealt with Prop 65 in the past. It's a long list, and it includes a lot of the common contaminants that you would expect to see in consumer products. So there's a phased implementation of the disclosures that are required under AB 1200. So starting in January 2023, manufacturers of cookware that is sold in the state which contains 1 or more intentionally added chemicals in the handle or on the food or beverage contact surfaces of the product. And that's an important limiting factor in this law that is worth sort of calling out. It's not anywhere in the product. It is just if these chemicals exist where you would expect someone to touch the product or where there would be interaction with food or beverages. But if the candidate chemicals are in those locations on the product, then on the website for that particular cookware product, you need to provide a list of each of those chemicals. You need to provide some information about how and why DTSC identified the chemical, and essentially provide the tools for people to get additional information to make their own decisions about how they feel about the safety of that product, given that these chemicals are in it. So that was January 2023, the website warnings. The next transition was to the actual on-product warnings. And there has been a lot of consternation about this for understandable reasons. But in simple terms, what this says was essentially your cookware product label needs to include essentially the same information, a list of all of the chemicals, not just one, like what is required under Prop 65, all the chemicals that are present in the handle or on the nonstick surface. You can see an example here on the left, which Fran actually put together, and I think is a wonderful example. You have to provide some of the explanatory information in multiple languages and include a QR code and a link to the website where you provide all the additional information that we discussed in the prior slide. Now, a lot of members of the industry have said, I can't do that. my labels are not big enough for me to list out the entire list of potential chemicals that are in these products. And for many cookware products, the list is fairly long. If you take stainless steel, for example, there are a number of candidate chemicals that are just in the normal formulation of stainless steel. Doesn't have anything to do with the safety of the product. It's the same stainless steel formulation that's FDA approved. It's the same formulation we've been using for decades, but it does include some of these chemicals. So there's been a discussion about how to best provide these on-product labels. The challenge has been that there was not a California agency identified to oversee this law. That has now changed. The Department of Toxic Substance Control is in charge of enforcing and interpreting this law. So we now have someone to go to get some guidance. Nothing has been issued yet, but I think there will be continued efforts to do outreach to them to try to get some clarification. But the law as it stands today is both on the website and on the product packaging itself, you need to provide a complete list of the candidate chemicals that are in the handles or in the food contact surfaces. The last important prohibition in AB 1200 is one that I think a lot of people might have missed in their initial read, because you focus on the labeling requirements, but there's also a prohibition on what you can say about the product. Starting in January 2023 for websites, January 24 for packaging, you are not allowed to make a claim that the cookware is free of any specific chemical on the designated list unless no individual chemical from that chemical group or class is intentionally added to the product. Now, what does that mean? In the case of PFAS, as Fran did a great job of explaining, there are thousands of chemicals that fall within that family designation. The current best estimate is somewhere north of 15,000. What that means is you cannot say this product is PFOA free, one individual PFAS chemical, if you intentionally add any other PFAS compound. So you can't say it is free of one PFAS if you add any of the other 14,999 that may be out there. And so I think we haven't seen enforcement around this, but this may be an area where, based on some of the claims that companies are making, because there is a lot of customer demand to say PFOA free, PFOS free, PFAS free, this marketing prohibition in this law, something similar in the Colorado law, may result in some enforcement where people aren't paying close enough attention to whether they're really making sure that they're not intentionally adding anything in that class or family of chemicals. So that's the overview of a good example law of what's required for the labeling and disclosure category. We'll transition now to Minnesota HF 2310, or MARA's law, which is the first cookware prohibition to go into effect in the country. And the prohibition went into effect in January 2025. I want to highlight some other features of this law. The first is back in August of 2023, the prohibition on lead and cadmium went into effect. We'll talk about the specifics of that in the next section, but just keep that date in your minds. And then the 2026 and 2032 dates that you see here refer back to that dragnet provision that I mentioned earlier. So starting in January 2026, all manufacturers of consumer products that are sold in Minnesota, which include intentionally added PFAS, need to disclose the presence of PFAS to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And then in January 2032, all of those companies are required to have reformulated to remove the intentionally added PFAS from those products, unless you get a currently unavoidable use designation. So prohibition on intentionally added PFAS in cookware already in effect in Minnesota. If you are not a cookware company, or if you sell products that are not cookware, there are still some compliance deadlines that will be coming up in the next few years that will apply if you have a relationship with this chemistry. So what does this actually mean? So to get into a little more detail on what the Minnesota law specifically says, plain and simple, beginning January 1st, 2025, you may not sell, offer for sale, or distribute for sale in the state cookware which contains intentionally added PFAS. Does not include the resale of used products, but it does cover pretty much any sale of new products that are being brought into the state. And that is as of January 1st. So there's no sell-through provision for things that are on the shelves on January 1st. Every sale that occurs after January 1st must be a sale of compliant cookware. The definition of cookware in the statute is quite broad. It includes some specific examples: pots, pans, skillets, grills, baking sheets, baking molds, trays, bowls, and cooking utensils. But when we hear about these cookware PFAS laws, I think a lot of people default to just a understanding of pots and pans. It is much broader than that and pulls in a lot of other types of products as well. MPCA has issued some guidance on that, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but it is a very broad definition of what constitutes cookware. And last, intentionally added. So this is an important concept. It flows across all of the state cookware, not just cookware, sorry, all state PFAS laws that have been passed so far prohibit intentionally added PFAS. There is no state law that prohibits all PFAS or requires that a product be PFAS free. The reason for that being, contamination from PFAS is incredibly prevalent in the manufacturing process, and not because of any malicious intent. So, for example, if you make a product, PFAS could be introduced from the building materials in your manufacturing facility. It could be introduced because the people working on your line used a certain shampoo that day and touched the product. There are an incredible number of potential sources of contamination. And to their credit, state legislatures have recognized that and have decided that they won't require the products to be PFAS free, but they are going to ask industry to look at their manufacturing process and their ingredients and remove any intentionally added PFAS. So the definition in Minnesota is PFAS deliberately added during the manufacture of a product where the continued presence of PFAS is desired in the final product because it provides some specific function or it allows the product to perform in a certain way. So there is some ability on the parts of companies to look at their supply chain, see what they're choosing to add to the product, and control for that. So as you might imagine, a law as sweeping as this one, particularly in terms of its impact on this industry, prompted a lot of questions. So MPCA has been issuing some guidance documents and had some fairly helpful webinars to sort of expand on what they, as the regulating agency, the enforcing agency, view as falling within the different definitions. The biggest question I think that came up for them is, what is cookware? Where do you draw that line between what everyone agrees is obviously cookware and something that is so distanced from the definition in the statute that it really shouldn't be regulated? And so what they said was, we consider cookware to be everything that's outlined in the statute, but also different forms of the listed items. So, which contain a nonstick coating, which contain intentionally added PFAS. So everyone said, well, that's somewhat helpful, but can you provide specific examples? So they identified things like an electric wok, a waffle maker, air fryers, if they have an internal component that's something like a pan or a baking sheet or a tray or a grill, which many do. So the idea is electrified versions of the types of cookware that are outlined in the statutory definition fall within the scope of the regulation if they have a component where you have intentionally added PFAS in a nonstick coating. They did provide one example of something that falls outside of these regulations. They said that coffee makers and those types of electrified appliances are just too far outside of this definition. So they're not going to enforce the law against those types of appliances. Practically speaking, companies are making their own determinations here, sometimes in coordination with MPCA. But for anyone in this space, especially in those gray areas of more the countertop appliance space, very important to make sure that you've at least gone through the exercise of determining which of your products do or do not fall under this law, and documenting that in case you ever get questions in the future. So, to provide some additional not so great news, PFAS was sort of the first wave of what I consider this generation of regulations of contaminants in consumer products. In the cookware space, we're seeing a trend towards regulating lead and cadmium as well. So far, Minnesota and Washington State have passed laws on this topic, and they present real changes to the way these chemicals are being regulated and real challenges to the industry. So I wanted to start by just providing kind of an overview of why this is quite a sea change. The first and probably the most important point is, up to this point, FDA regulations of food contact surfaces, Proposition 65, European regulations have all looked at what is the migration from the substance used to make the cookware into food or beverages. But they'd never regulated total concentration. It was all about what exposure, what dosage are people exposed to from the normal use of this cookware. What the Minnesota and Washington laws do is sort of flip that on its head and regulate the total concentration of the entire product. So rather than looking at migration from just the food or beverage contact surface, we're now looking at total concentration in the entire product, which is, as you might imagine, a huge change in terms of how people are going to have to do their testing, what it means for the supply chain and the materials that go into these types of products. And it's a real challenge. On top of that, the limits that are set in the laws are extremely low and frankly cannot be met for certain types of raw materials, particularly recycled content. So to go into a little more detail on the Minnesota law, we could go to the next slide, Fran. So Minnesota's law, and this was tacked on to Amara's law. I think most people focus on the PFAS provisions, but this one is pretty impactful as well. And as I mentioned in the timeline slide, went into effect back in August of 2023. So the law says a person may not import, manufacture, sell, hold for sale, or distribute, or offer for use in the state covered products that contain lead at more than 90 ppm or cadmium at more than 75 ppm. Interestingly, those standards came from a toy standard, which measures migration, not total content. So they pulled those numbers from a set of regulations for a very different product set and not a total concentration limit. So there are some interesting questions to be discussed there. There is a carve out if products are regulated by federal law. There's preemption there. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to apply to cookware, at least currently. And the law allows Minnesota to MPCA to coordinate with some other agencies on enforcement. If we can go to the next slide. So I do want to highlight that while we're here to talk about pots and pans, this has wide-ranging implications. It applies to all of the product categories that you see here. So an incredibly broad, sweeping set of restrictions on a wide range of products, some of which have historically been subject to testing and regulation for these chemicals, but not all. And so again, as with the PFAS law, MPCA has been getting a lot of questions. As Fran alluded to, there are ongoing discussions between the CBA and some members with MPCA about the appropriate test method. But just to provide some clarifications here, the way the law is written, it's a little unclear whether or not they intended to apply to every component of the product. They did confirm that yes, you don't just do total digestion of the entire product. You would do it of the individual components, and each individual component needs to comply with the limit. There's another question about what is the preferred test method? I mean, if we are to comply with this, how are we to demonstrate compliance? In their guidance, MPCA has identified ASTM F963. For those of you who don't know what that means, and I didn't until I looked it up, that is the test method for choice. And it is where the 75 and 90 ppm limits came from. Interestingly, it requires a two-step testing process. The first is to measure total concentration, but that's really just a screening. If you pass that, then your product passes. If you don't, then you do an extraction test. So again, looking at migration of these chemicals that translates to some form of human exposure. There are a lot of conversations going on with MPCA about whether that test is what should be applied. There was a new test recommended by FDA specific to measuring lead in cookware. So I think there is an ongoing discussion about how companies will be required to track compliance against this law. But as of now, it does present a real challenge as drafted to the industry. Washington is similar, in some ways worse. So the compliance deadline for that law is January 1st. Very similar description of the activities that are prohibited, but the limit is much lower. So in this case, prohibits either the entire cookware or cookware components, which contain lead at 5 parts per million. There was a proposal during the legislative process to raise that to 90 ppm to be aligned with Minnesota. That was rejected, and they went forward with 5 ppm. In the interest of time, I won't belabor the point because the scope of the law is essentially the same as Minnesota, but just to flag that this is, again, another total concentration limit, but with a much lower standard than the Minnesota law. So I think this one also presents some challenges and will be the subject of a lot of discussion in the lead up to that January compliance date. Very quick side note, the good intention behind this law was as a result of a study of cookware that a bunch of refugees had brought with them from their home countries, which was found to have pretty high concentrations of lead, which was leading to a lot of migration to the food that they were making. So it came out of a very real health concern, but I think it's translated into a law that is not beneficial from a health standpoint and presents a lot of compliance challenges to the industry. So I realize that was a lot to cover. We do have a lot of resources built into the slide deck and on our website, but hopefully this gives you at least a good overview of the landscape here, and certainly welcome any questions or additional thoughts people have.
Thank you very much, Tom. So there are actually a couple of questions in chat. And the first one, actually, I think is for you, Tobias, which is it possible to use the blueprint of what's been done in the US for advocacy and lobbying? Can it be used in Europe?
Yes and no. At the moment, when we look at the procedure, at the moment it is still sitting, the complete draft is sitting at ECHA. So a little bit like comparable maybe to the EPA in the US. And what you do in it, what we do with ECHA is really we give them somehow the science background. We handed that in. The problem for ECHA is it's just too much information. They cannot handle all that information. They are just overwhelmed. And so that's very difficult for them. And so what we will probably have to do is do something similar to what CSA is doing in the US, and then say, okay, let's have a look at the European level and then also at the national level. But this will come in 25, 26, 27. So it's early to do that. The complete process is a little bit slower than it is in the US.
Thank you, Tobias. There is someone who's asked an important question. Tom, this goes back to clarification on the marketing component for AB 1200. They're clarifying that they cannot say that a product is free of PFAS if it has any of the approximately 15,000 chemicals in the product already. So does that mean they cannot use PFAS-free stickers? I would just like to comment on that one from a CBA side. We never recommend the word free. It ties to what Tom meant on cross-contamination. Made without or made without intentionally added would be the terminology we recommend, for the very reason that due to potential unlimited avenues of cross-contamination, if it was ever tested, it could be found. Free means zero. So we say on any marketing effort, you may have never used the word free, but Tom, I'll leave it up to you or Steve to talk about the AB 1200 and this question.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. So from a regulatory standpoint, the statement here is correct. If your product contains any intentionally added PFAS, so you have to mean for it to be there to provide some beneficial purpose. So any member of that family of 15,000 compounds, you can't say that it's free of PFAS or that it's free of any particular PFAS compound. So if you use, and the definition of PFAS in AB 1200 probably would include PTFE. So if you use PTFE, you can't say it's PFOA free. So generally speaking, yes, I think the way you frame the issue is right. To Fran's point, and maybe to build that out a little more in terms of the risk, there's a regulatory risk of an agency in California or Colorado coming after you and saying, you made this claim, we think it's untrue because you intentionally add another PFAS compound. The more present risk, though, from a PFAS-free claim is actually a private party bringing a false claim or false advertising lawsuit against you. We are seeing lots of these come up. They're focused on a lot of different product categories, but the underlying theory is the same. It is on your packaging, in your website, or sometimes even in your, shareholder statements, sort of more third-party communications. You are making claims that your products are PFAS-free, that they're safe, that they're organic, and we, the plaintiff, have tested that product, and there is some indication of PFAS there. So those claims are false or misleading. So we've been counseling clients along the same lines that Fran just outlined. PFAS free is not something that you can really substantiate in the modern manufacturing environment. Made without, designed without, no intentionally added. Those are claims that you can actually measure against and verify and substantiate. So PFAS free is it's a loaded statement right now, unfortunately.
And just so everyone knows, I am monitoring both the Q&A section and chat. And next one's for you, Steve. And I'm going to jump around. So if I will get back to, we'll get as many as we can. This webinar will close promptly at 3. So I'm going to try to get as many as I can in. Steve, they're asking, how are you monitoring legislation in states that are currently not restricted or have current proposed legislation? And what does someone look for in proposed legislation to be wary of?
Yeah, it's a good question, Cindy. Thank you. We use a couple different things. I mean, in the theme of today's meeting, we use partnerships as well. So the American Chemistry Council, ACC, is on top of this. Various chambers, groups like the Industry Alliance up in Vermont. Everybody with whom we've made contact and have connections is looking for these issues. I do have a vendor in Washington, D.C. I'm not going to give them a shout out to everybody, but I can share it with people privately who has what they claim to be, and I found it to be useful, proprietary software that sweeps state legislatures in all 50 state capitals several times a week. And the second part of your question, though, is important. It really comes up just as and Tom and Tobias have said this, I believe, the same language appears over and over, intentionally added PFAS. And it might be seemingly benign, like a labeling issue, but we've seen that, and I saw that here in California, that was amended to become a ban. So if it's about PFAS, if it lists products or processes, I would keep an eye on it, and that's what we do as well. So I hope that answered. There's a lot of ways to do it, but they're coming fast and furious.
Thank you, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
There is a question about AB 1200. The question is that they want to make sure they understand correctly that under AB 1200, all substances listed present in a coating need a warning on labels of consumer goods. I'd like to clarify this, but Tom, you could jump in. It's if the substance is on one of the DTC lists. If the substance is on one of the California DTC lists, then yes, it has to go on that label. It has to be both on your website and your label. And Tom, I'm going to add to this. Could you, since one of the points of this webinar is also to talk to retailers, we've had a lot of questions on AB 1200 on a retailer's responsibility on what they put on their website and what goes on their packaging. So if they have private label, especially. So both the question to clarify what substances get listed on a label and then what's the retailer's responsibility.
Sure. So the first question in terms of what needs to be included on your label, if you intentionally add any of the chemicals that are on that DTSC list, then they need to be included on the label. Someone else, I think, also asked about whether you need to do Prop 65 and AB 1200 disclosures. The answer is yes. Although the Prop 65 list is included in that DTSC list of candidate chemicals, the disclosure that you provide for AB 1200 is different than the warning you would provide for Prop 65. So you do need to provide both if you think both are relevant for your product. In terms of retailer obligations to provide these warnings, so for any private label products, you are considered the manufacturer. If your brand is on the product for regulatory purposes, you are the manufacturer and need to comply with these requirements. In terms of retailers who may be just selling, distributing others' products, including through e-commerce, I mean, obviously the on-label warnings would be the manufacturer's obligation. Website warnings are mostly targeted at the manufacturer, but retailers should consider whether or not they want to include any of those disclosures on their website, just to avoid any uncertainty about enforcement.
May I add that we talk a lot about the PTFE coated cookware, but if you have a stainless steel piece of cookware, the stainless steel is in contact with the food. And in the stainless steel, you have nickel and you have cobalt. Both of them are in the DTSC list, so they have to be mentioned. So you have to be very careful of that you're not just focusing on PTFE or on PFAS. This is covering all types of materials.
Thank you, Tobias. There are a lot of great questions, and I'm watching the clock. We're down to about a minute and a half. So I just want to put this on the screen before we go and put our websites on here. Remind everybody better, it's keep asking questions, reach out to us. I'm actually going to skip this slide and get right to our websites. I believe our contact information will also be provided with the recording of this webinar. And I'll try to close this out on one on lead and cadmium because we've talked a lot about PFAS. And this was asked, thank you, Larry, for this question. His question was, doesn't putting limits to the total weight of the product instead of the component help to minimize the ppm level, or would lead and cadmium be found in other non-food contact components? The question, Tom, I'll leave this up to you, but from what the real issue is, it's that we want to get away from the measurement of lead and cadmium in the total product to just what's leaching out. And actually the limits work against us right now as they're set. But Tom, if you want to expand on.
Yeah, it's a really good point in terms of how you calculate, like what sample do you use to measure that total concentration? There's two issues with the way they've set it up in the law. The first is it regulates total concentration in the entire product, but also in the components. So you need to pass on both levels. So every rivet needs to pass and your whole composed cookware needs to pass. So you can't sort of game the system by having a lot of mass of a component that doesn't contribute lead or cadmium to offset your total concentration. The other thing to consider is this shift, right? The increased focus on not just the food contact surface, but all the components of a product. And up to this point, all the testing that's been done in cookware has been focused on food contact. So the substrates that are behind a PTFE coating would now be sort of exposed to testing. And I think there is concern about not not health concern, but a compliance concern about whether those substrate materials may have levels of lead or cadmium that would create regulatory issues, but not health issues for users. So we'll understand more about that over time, but I think Fran's point is the right one. This shift to total concentration does not equate to an increase in consumer safety. What we have been doing up to this point, what FDA has approved, what states have approved to measure exposure is the way to monitor health and human safety, not total concentration. So I think that's kind of the course correct that I think a lot of people in the industry are hoping to see over the next few months.
Thank you, Tom. With that, we are at 3:01. We will work with the IHA to capture the questions from the chat and the Q&A. We thank everyone. Big shout out and thanks to the IHA. We are so grateful for their partnership, and thank you to Tom, Tobias, Steve. So grateful to work with you guys. Looking forward to seeing everybody in Chicago. You will see the four of us doing another legislation update at the Inspiration Theater. So watch out for that and make sure to stop by. Thank you, everyone.